Tonight, the stones of Jerusalem seem to breathe, and the wind that moves through the olive branches carries a tremor older than empires, as if the city itself remembers a promise whispered by prophets and sealed by the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. My friend, this will shock you. Witnesses say that today, at the very heart of the holy city, the courts were stirred again, voices rose, prayers ascended, and the tension around the mount felt less like a headline and more like a drumbeat from the pages of Scripture. You won't believe how precisely our moment mirrors the words of Yeshua, who pointed to Jerusalem as the signpost of the last days. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, and when they say, "Peace and safety," sudden destruction comes echo like thunder across the valleys tonight, reminding that the prophetic clock is not late, it's exact. Look closely at the Mount Har Habayit to the Jews, Haram al-Sharif to the Muslims, where the thin line of the status quo has frayed under the weight of prayer, policy, and the passion of rival claims. And no, this is not a random turbulence, but the place where heaven and earth contend in the open. Reports throughout this year told of record numbers ascending on fast days, of overt prayers by political figures, of silent rules suddenly spoken aloud, and of a threshold crossed that many said would never be crossed again in public view. And each detail feels like a footstep approaching an ancient threshold foretold by prophets who saw both trembling and glory in the same vision. This is the ground where Zechariah saw nations gather, where Ezekiel measured gates and glory, and where Messiah's own feet will one day stand upon the Mount of Olives, splitting it in two, a scene that no camera can capture until the appointed day. Yet the stagecraft is already visible under the lights of our time. Do you hear it? The shofar blast in contested courtyards, the murmur of psalms beneath the dome's shadow, the gritty scrape of riot shields on ancient paving stones. And can you hear, under the sound, the whisper of the prophets saying, "This must happen, but the end is not yet, and I will gather the nations against Jerusalem. Then the Lord will go forth and fight." The politics are loud, but the prophecies are louder. Every escalation around prayer rites, every debate over sovereignty, every surge through the gates is being weighed on scales that are not human. And the needle moves toward a convergence long foretold by the Scriptures and echoed by watchmen in every generation, including voices today who tie these tremors to the very passages we cannot ignore. Matthew 24, Zechariah 12 and 14, and Revelation's unsealed sequences. And tonight, as dust settles over the stones and the lamps flicker along the colonnades, the sense is unmistakable. He appeared in the temple today, not in visible form, not yet in unveiled glory, but in the way the place itself is being readied, the way the storyline tightens, the way access, prayer, and presence are contended as if an unseen king is nearing his courts. Hold this in the heart. The world treats Jerusalem like a problem to manage, but heaven treats it like a promise to keep, and that is why the city refuses to sleep under treaties and talking points, insisting on fulfilling its destiny under the word spoken before there was a world. If a minister's prayer can shake global headlines, what will the Messiah's voice do when he cries from the gates? And who can stand when his feet touch the Mount of Olives and the valley splits like a curtain torn from top to bottom? Announcing the final act, not just of Israel's story, but of all nations accounting before the Holy One of Israel. My friend, the courts tremble again, and this will shock you. Leaders have walked the stones, murmured prayers where silence once held the line. And the weight of that act ripples through embassies and echoes through the prophet's words like a trumpet inside a cavern of time. Reports this year spoke of record surges to the Mount, of thousands ascending in a single day, pushing the fragile boundaries of an unwritten accord. While statesmen insisted the status quo remains, even as the ground felt unmistakably altered beneath their feet. You won't believe how precisely this aligns with Scripture's contour. When the center of the world becomes the center of contention, the pages of Zechariah crackle, and the language of all nations and that day stops feeling symbolic and starts sounding like an appraisal of the present hour. Listen to the wind crossing the colonnades, whispered prayers, firm steps, cameras humming, and then listen deeper to the ancient cadence buried in these stones, because prophecy is not just prediction, it is orchestration, and every contested prayer on the plateau is a note in a score written long ago. Analysts warn that tinkering with the arrangement atop the mount could ignite a regional flame, and yet the prophets foresaw a fire of another kind, the Lord himself stepping into the tempest. Feet on the Mount of Olives, creation parting like a garment before the King, a day when geography obeys divinity and valleys open for a people to pass through. The more policies insist on equilibrium, the more events lean toward culmination, and that is why the tremor in Jerusalem feels less like a crisis to manage and more like a countdown. No minister can pause. This is the hinge. Decades of "don't say it out loud" became a public chorus, with prayers filmed and vows declared, drawing rebukes from capitals and replies from ministries. Yet above the noise, Scripture's clarity stands. There will be a day, there will be a splitting. There will be a king whose presence redefines access, sovereignty and worship in a single appearing. Commentators argue over literal and symbolic readings, but the prophetic line does not bend to our comfort. It bends history toward a meeting between a city and its king. And the mount is the appointed stage, not because zealots demand it, but because the Word decreed it. So when thousands stream through the gates and headlines tally new records, treat those numbers as milestones along a road the prophets already mapped. Markers that say, keep watching, the hourglass is slimming. Tonight, the status quo is a thread drawn taut over an abyss, and every footfall makes it sing. While experts warn that a single cut could draw the region in like a storm pulls ships into its eye, a scenario the Scriptures described in sober, terrifying calm, nations gathered, the Lord arising, the mountain rending to make way for mercy and judgment alike. Take this to heart. If a minister's whispered prayer can shake parliaments, what will the unveiled voice do when he calls from the eastern sky, and who will stand when the ground itself kneels under his feet? My friend, lean in. The thread holding the mount's fragile balance is thinning. And this will shock you. What was once whispered is now public, filmed, debated in councils, and measured by the prophet's plumb line rather than poll numbers. A government minister led prayers atop the most sensitive stones in Jerusalem, and thousands surged on a fast day, setting a new record. Events that read like accelerants laid carefully along a fuse history has tried to keep damp, but which prophecy insists must burn toward a divine appointment. Analysts tally percentages and months. Watchmen hear footsteps, because when access, prayer, and sovereignty converge on the same courtyard, Scripture's phrases about that day and all nations stop sounding distant and start feeling like weather moving in from the horizon. Consider the warnings from security scholars. Alter the arrangement here and expect tremors across borders, ruptures with allies, and protests that spiral into an intifada, language of geopolitics that beneath the surface harmonizes with Zechariah's sober cadence of nations gathered, and a mountain that will not remain as it is when the king arrives. Ramadan's crowds swelled, tensions climbed, and even closures and reopenings became signals in a language the city speaks fluently. Escalation and restraint, like inhaling and exhaling before a cry that will split the air and the ridge alike. Official voices say, status quo, while the plaza murmurs, transition, and prophecy says, prepare. And these three lines are now crossing on the map beneath the dome's shadow. You won't believe how precisely headlines echo ancient patterns, records broken in pilgrim counts, live blogs ticking upward as if measuring a pulse, local authorities warning that holidays bring a hardening of lines and an uptick in raids, all while international responses flare and fade like heat lightning before the real storm. Reports from monitors describe a steady assertion of control, a redefinition by practice rather than pronouncement. And if this feels like small adjustments, remember that ships change oceans with slight turns of the rudder when maintained over time. Theologians may argue symbol versus literal, but Jerusalem keeps answering with events, and the Mount answers with pressure, and the prophets answer with a picture of feet on the ridge and a valley made for refuge in the very hour of upheaval. Hear the cadence. Prayers that used to be policed are now amplified by a minister's voice. A sense that once scandalized now set records. Condemnations that once chilled now cycle and fade, while the numbers rise again the next month. Each data point is a stone laid toward an appointment the city cannot cancel, and the risk memos from think tanks read like commentaries, written without intending to, describing exactly the sensitivities that Zechariah intoned in the language of glory and trembling. If a single morning's prayer can convene the world's councils, what will the King's Day convene? And who will argue status quo when the mountain itself redraws the map under his feet? My friend, step outside the walls and watch the nations lean in. This will shock you. What begins with a whispered prayer on the Mount now convenes ambassadors beneath the blue seal of the United Nations, where emergency sessions try to contain a fire, that prophecy already described as inevitable. Security Council chambers flicker with speeches about hostages, operations and red lines, yet the undercurrent is Jerusalem's gravity, the way one city bends global agendas and exposes the limits of diplomacy, when sacred space becomes the axis of history. You won't believe how precisely this matches Zechariah's cadence, a cup that makes surrounding peoples real, a stone too heavy for nations to lift without wounding themselves, a convergence that policy can delay but cannot dismiss. Listen to diplomats' way. Phrases like status quo, custodianship, and escalation, while analysts warn that the Mount's arrangement is not a domestic footnote but a regional fuse. Change it openly, and alliances fray, accords wobble, and the street answers faster than chancelleries can draft statements. France condemns a minister's assent. Think tanks enumerate risks to ties with Jordan, Egypt, and the Abraham Accords. If prayer protocols shift from tacit to declared, from individual whispers to communal rites, the very fact that normalization with Saudi Arabia is discussed with footnotes about Al-Aqsa shows the temple's shadow falling not just across stones, but across statecraft, turning theology into geopolitics in real time. Meanwhile, live blogs measure surges on the Mount, NGOs warn of creeping control, and governors predict holiday escalations, as if calendars themselves now forecast conflict like seasons, foretell rain. Reports map closures and reopenings, swells during Ramadan, and the percentage rise in visits, translating devotion and defiance into data points that still cannot quantify the tremor that Scripture names simply that day. The more the world says manage, the more the word says gather, and in that tension a chorus swells that no resolution can silence until the king speaks from the ridge above the Kidron. Prophecy does not mock parliaments. It measures them, showing how power arrays itself around Jerusalem and discovers its own limits in the attempt to steady a stone that heaven has set. Zechariah saw what committees cannot, a moment when the siege is not just military, but moral and spiritual, when nations find themselves intoxicated by the need to decide Jerusalem's fate, only to realize the city was deciding theirs all along. On that day, feet will touch the Mount of Olives, and cartographers will redraw lines not by accord, but by the shockwave of presence, a valley opening like a door for a remnant to pass through toward light. So hear this, my friend, if a single ascent can ripple through embassies, what will the arrival do to the halls of power? If an emergency session can shake markets, what will the trumpet do to mountains? My friend, draw close to the gates and listen. The psalms under breath become a roar in the bones, and this will shock you. The footsteps heard in courtyards are now reverberating in marble halls, where emissaries debate urgencies and red lines, while Jerusalem answers with a language older than speech, the language of fulfilled promise. In emergency sessions, voices plead for de-escalation, for corridors of mercy, for hostages and bread. Yet above the microphones hangs the weight of a mountain whose future cannot be settled by vote, because the script of that ridge was written by a hand that nations cannot amend. You won't believe how flawlessly this syncs with Zechariah's vision. Nations gathered and reeling, strategies failing, until the Lord himself steps into the scene, and geography yields like a curtain parting before a king returning to his own house. Look at the faces in the courtyards, fathers with eyes on the gates, mothers counting children as if counting hours, elders watching the line between prayer and provocation blur with every assent and every chant. And then look again through the prophet's eyes, where the city is not merely tense but pregnant, with a day named in heaven, the day of the Lord. Reports tell of ministers praying openly, records broken in assents, live blogs marking surges like a pulse, officials insisting no change, while NGOs argue the change is already lived on the ground, a slow redefinition by practice that words can't conceal for long. Security studies warn that altering the Mount's arrangement risks a regional shock, strains with custodians, and a cascade of condemnations in international forums. And if that sounds like politics, hear the echo. It is prophecy's staging. the prelude to a footfall that will make the earth itself rearrange. Now lift the eyes eastward, across the Kidron to the Mount of Olives, and let the Scripture speak with its plain force. On that day his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, and the mountain will split east to west, opening a valley for the remnant to flee, a path of mercy cut by Majesty's weight, as real as the dust on sandals, as final as a trumpet at dawn. Commentators argue symbols and timelines, but the text stands like the ridge itself. And from age to age the faithful have pointed to this hinge, saying, "When the city is pressed and the nations ring it like iron, then the Lord will arise to fight, and the mountain will obey his step." This is not allegory to the mother who prays by the eastern wall. This is map and mercy, a promised escape through rock that once yielded to a staff and sea, Jerusalem's exodus written into stone. Hear the crescendo. A minister's prayer ignites chambers abroad. Governors warn of storms on holy days. Monitors describe creeping control. And every argument circles the same axis: access to the place of presence, the definition of worship on the hill, where courts remember a fire that once fell, and a glory that once filled a house not made with human boasting. The world drafts communique, heaven drafts a valley, and between the two drafts hangs a people who have kept vigil through empires, waiting for the moment when vigil turns to vision, and the eastern sky blooms with the arrival that ends arrivals. So, my friend, listen for the final cadence. If a whispered minyan can summon a council of nations, what will the shout of the archangel summon? If a single ascent rearranges alliances, what will the king's descent do to mountains? The valley is not yet open, but the ridge is listening. The gates are not yet lifted, but the hinges are warm, and as the courtyards breathe in, ready to exhale a cry that splits the sky, the Scriptures stand not as poetry but as schedule, and the hour approaches when he appears not in rumor but in radiance, not in prelude but in person, and Jerusalem will know her king. Blessed are the people who know the joyful sound and respond. Pes 89:15. If this blast awakened you, subscribe and turn on the bell to stay watchful with us. Share this and leave your prayer request in the comments. Between fear and hope we choose the word. Matthew 24:35. Stay with us, the next blast could come at any moment.